Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Glad to be here.
So right out of the gate, I want you, the listener, to picture a scenario. Imagine you've just been hired, handed the keys, and given the title of CEO for this massive, historically significant corporation.
Okay, sounds pretty good so far.
Right. But the moment you walk through the doors, you realize there's a terrifying catch.
There's always a catch.
Exactly. The building is structurally compromised. It is literally catching fire in the basement.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And the board of directors, they're actively embezzling funds to cover up a string of just catastrophic failures.
It's a complete mess.
A total mess. And your direct competitors are currently outside launching a hostile, aggressive takeover.
Sounds incredibly stressful.
It is. But here's the real kicker. Your job description isn't to save the company.
Wait, really? Then what is it?
Your job is to stand in the main lobby with a megaphone, look all those executives in the eye, and tell them that the building is going to collapse.
Oh, man.
Yeah, you have to tell them their careers are over, and this is the best part, that it is entirely their own fault.
And to push that analogy to its natural conclusion, those executives and employees are absolutely not going to listen to you.
No, not at all.
They are going to despise the messenger. I mean, they will actively conspire to silence anyone who threatens the fragile illusion that, everything is fine.
Exactly. So today we are taking a deep dive into the first 25 chapters of the biblical book of Jeremiah.
It's a heavy one.
It really is. And let me set expectations right here.
Yeah.
We aren't doing a dry, dusty history lecture.
Right. That's not the goal.
No, our mission today is basically an extraction. We are diving into this ancient text to pull out the practical wisdom, the moral insight, and the profound life application that sits right beneath the surface for you, the modern listener.
Because when you actually peel back the layers of this specific text, it is shockingly, almost uncomfortably relevant to the 21st century.
It really is. So let's start with the context. What is actually happening in the world when this book kicks off?
Well, the historical context alone is just a masterclass in societal pressure. We are looking at the latter half of the 7th century BCE.
Okay.
And the kingdom of Judah is this tiny, incredibly vulnerable nation. Geographically, it sits on a land bridge right between Africa and Asia.
Which is pretty much the worst place to be if massive empires decide to go to war.
Precisely. That means it is caught directly in the crosshairs of these warring superpowers. To the south, you have the ancient established might of Egypt.
Right.
And to the north, you have the terrifying rising juggernaut of the Babylonian Empire. They've just crushed the Assyrians, and they are looking to expand.
So Judah is basically a geopolitical speed bump.
Exactly. The external pressure is just suffocating.
It's an absolute pressure cooker. The air is thick with anxiety about national security, shifting alliances, impending war. It sounds like the evening news.
It really does. But the internal landscape of Judah is arguably worse.
Oh, totally. Because we have King Josiah, right? He comes to power and attempts this massive religious and cultural reformation.
He does. He finds the lost book of the law. He starts cleaning out the temple. He mandates the removal of all these idols from the high places.
So on paper, it looks like a massive national revival.
Right, on paper. But the text reveals that this was fundamentally superficial. It was compliance, not transformation.
And that distinction is huge.
It's crucial. Josiah changed the official policies, but the internal compass of the general population remained completely corrupted.
So the society is basically experiencing a severe decay from the inside out.
Yeah, exactly. You have systemic injustice, exploitation of the vulnerable, and a complete abandonment of their foundational ethics.
But it's all masked by this fresh coat of religious paint.
Right. They are teetering on the brink of absolute irreversible collapse. And right into the middle of this catastrophic, high-stakes mess steps this young man named Jeremiah.
Which is what makes reading these first 25 chapters feel less like reading ancient history and more like, staring into a mirror.
It really does mirror a lot of today's issues.
Yeah, we see all of our own modern acute anxieties reflected back at us. We're looking at a society dealing with an overwhelming flood of conflicting information, the rapid decay of once trusted institutions.
The rise of performative morality, too.
Yes, where managing a public image matters far more than actual character. And of course, the agonizing, devastating burnout of the few people who are actually trying to tell the truth.
It is a staggering mandate to hand to anyone. And before Jeremiah can even begin to address the crumbling architecture of his society, he has to confront this massive, paralyzing internal hurdle.
Which is?
He has to overcome his own crippling sense of inadequacy.
Oh, man. Let's get right into the mechanisms of that. Because chapter 1 gives us Jeremiah's origin story, and it is incredibly raw.
It's very relatable.
It is. He's young. He lives in a small, somewhat marginalized town called Anathoth, which is just a few miles northeast of Jerusalem.
He comes from a lineage of rural priests, right?
Yeah, exactly. And when the divine call comes, commissioning him to be a, quote, prophet to the nations, his immediate visceral reaction is to basically recoil.
He literally says, Lord God, behold, I cannot speak, for I am a child.
Right. It is perhaps the most universally understandable reaction in the entire text.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he's looking at the sheer scale of the crisis, the geopolitical threats of Babylon, the deep societal rot in Jerusalem, the superficiality of the king's reforms.
And then he looks at his own resume.
Exactly. He realizes there's this terrifying, almost comical mismatch between what the moment requires and what he believes he actually possesses.
It's a textbook definition of imposter syndrome, but magnified to a national scale.
Right.
If you are handed the megaphone in that burning corporate lobby we talked about, your first instinct is going to be to look around for an adult.
Yeah, you think, I don't have the vocabulary for this.
I don't have the institutional authority. I don't have the gravitas. If I speak, they will eat me alive.
The psychological weight of that inadequacy is just universal.
It is. So the really interesting question is how the text responds to this fear.
Yeah.
Because our modern instinct, like if we were coaching Jeremiah today, would be to pump him up.
Oh, yeah, we'd give him a total pep talk.
Fake it till you make it. Project confidence. Focus on your communication skills.
But that is entirely absent here. The divine response bypasses his ego completely. And this is where we uncover our first piece of core wisdom.
Okay, what's the response?
The response is, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you came forth out of the womb, I sanctified you, and I ordained you a prophet unto the nations.
Wow. That phrase, before I formed you, that completely shifts the paradigm of qualification.
It does. It moves the metric from acquired skills to intrinsic design.
That's fascinating.
That is the operative mechanism here. The text is establishing that his readiness for the task is not predicated on his public speaking abilities, his age, or his social standing in Jerusalem.
It's predicated on his creator's intentional pre-existing purpose.
Exactly. He's being told that his very architecture, formulated before he even drew breath, was designed for this exact friction.
Okay, but how does his brain actually process that paradigm shift? Because that's a huge concept to grasp.
To help him process it, he's given two highly specific, highly symbolic visions. It's meant to train his eyes to see reality differently.
Those visions are so vivid, but at first glance, honestly a bit confusing.
They can be.
The first thing he is asked to look at is the branch of an almond tree, which frankly feels a bit pastoral and gentle for a prophet who is about to announce the destruction of a nation.
Right, it seems weirdly calm.
Yeah.
But to understand the weight of that vision, we have to look at the brilliant linguistic mechanism operating in the original Hebrew.
Okay, let's break that down.
So, Jeremiah says he sees the branch of an almond tree. The Hebrew word for almond tree is shaket.
Shaket.
Yeah, it literally translates to the waking tree or the hasty tree. In the Levant, the almond tree is famous because it is the very first tree to blossom.
Oh, like early in the year?
Exactly, often in late January or early February, while the rest of the botanical world is still dead, dormant, and asleep in the dead of winter.
So it's a biological early riser. It wakes up before the environment gives it permission to.
Precisely the point. And the moment Jeremiah identifies the shaked branch, the divine response is, "You have seen well, for I am watching over my word to perform it."
Okay, where is the connection there?
The Hebrew word for watching over or being alert is shoked.
Oh, shaket and shoked.
Exactly. It is a deliberate visual and auditory pun.
That's brilliant.
The message is, just as the almond tree is awake, alert, and hastening to blossom before anything else, I am awake, I am alert, and I am hastening to fulfill the reality of my words.
The psychological impact of that for Jeremiah must have been profound. I mean, he's terrified that his words will just be empty air, right? Powerless against the massive political machines of his day.
Yeah, just noise.
But the vision of the waking tree tells him that the words he is commissioned to speak carry this active, hastening, unstoppable momentum. They aren't just sounds, their impending reality.
And that impending reality is immediately cemented by the second vision. And this one strips away any lingering pastoral comfort.
Yeah, this one is much darker. He sees a boiling, seething cauldron, and the face of it is tipped away from the north, tilting directly down toward Judah.
The imagery is visceral.
It really is. A massive iron pot of scalding water, bubbling violently, just starting to tip over the edge. It's the sheer terror of an approaching, unstoppable disaster.
And it represents the encroaching Babylonian Empire. Babylon is to the north, and the evil breaking forth upon the inhabitants of the land is this inevitable invasion.
So Jeremiah's internal architecture is being fortified by holding these two immense realities in tension.
Exactly. The waking, alert, unstoppable power of his underlying purpose and the scalding, violent reality of the environment he is stepping into.
Let's translate this into a modern application for the listener. Because the takeaway here is that the feeling of being ready is kind of a myth.
Oh, totally. We waste years of our lives waiting to feel qualified.
We really do. We wait until we think we have the perfect vocabulary or the bulletproof credential or the total absence of fear before we step into a difficult leadership role.
Or before we call out toxicity in our workplace or have a necessary but painful confrontation in our families.
Yeah, we wait for the imposter syndrome to just evaporate.
But the imposter syndrome rarely evaporates because it's rooted in comparing our finite skills to the infinite complexity of the world.
That makes so much sense. So true resilience does not come from believing you are invincible or perfectly skilled.
No, it comes from anchoring yourself in a deep, intrinsic sense of purpose. When Jeremiah is commissioned, the promise given to him is highly specific.
Right, the text says, I have made you this day a fortified city and an iron pillar and bronze walls against the whole land.
Yes.
I love the physics of that promise, an iron pillar. Because if you look at the mechanics of what that actually means, it isn't a promise of safety.
Not at all.
An iron pillar doesn't make the wind stop blowing. It doesn't put a magical force field around the building. It just promises structural integrity.
Exactly. God explicitly tells him, they shall fight against you. The resistance is guaranteed.
The hatred is a feature, not a bug, of the assignment.
The promise is simply that when the storm hits, the pillar will not snap.
That is a fundamental reorientation of expectations. Because we often operate under the subconscious assumption that if we are doing the right thing, if we are aligned with truth, the path should eventually become smooth.
We think people should eventually recognize our good intentions and applaud us.
Yeah, but the text shatters that illusion. Doing the necessary thing will likely be incredibly painful and invite fierce opposition, but you possess the structural integrity to withstand it. So for the listener, here is a practical reflection to anchor this. When you are facing an overwhelming task, a massive pivot in your career, a systemic issue you need to address in your community, or a moral stand you can no longer avoid, and your brain starts broadcasting the message, I am a child, I cannot speak, I am not ready.
Stop looking at your resume.
Yes. Look for your almond branch. Ask yourself, what is the intrinsic, unshakable purpose that I am built for right now? What makes me an iron pillar in this specific situation, regardless of whether anyone applauds me?
It is about rooting yourself in the why of the necessity rather than the how of your current anxieties.
Wow, that's powerful.
And once Jeremiah accepts that structural integrity, he is capable of delivering his first major diagnostic message to his society.
Which takes us to chapters 2 and 3.
Right. And this diagnosis is one of the most penetrating psychological evaluations of human dissatisfaction ever recorded.
It is devastatingly accurate. The core wisdom here targets the mechanics of our misdirected desires.
The fundamental argument is that human beings routinely exhaust themselves seeking life, meaning, and baseline satisfaction in systems and objects that are structurally incapable of providing it.
And the metaphor used in chapter 2, verse 13, is just incredible. The ancient audience would have felt this viscerally.
Absolutely. The text states, my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed them out cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water.
To truly grasp the brilliance of this, we have to understand the hydroengineering and the daily reality of life in the ancient Levant.
Yeah.
Because we just turn on a tap today.
Right, exactly. So in the ancient world, water was not a convenience. It was absolute survival. Getting water dictates the rhythm of your entire existence.
Right.
So a fountain of living waters refers to a natural artesian spring. This is water that is continuously flowing, naturally filtered, cold, fresh, and reliable.
And most importantly, it bubbles up from the earth entirely independent of human effort.
Yes, it is a pure gift. All you have to do is approach it and receive it.
But a cistern is a completely different mechanism.
Radically different. A cistern is a large, artificial, underground storage tank. Creating one requires back-breaking, violent labor.
You literally have to carve a massive hole into solid limestone, right?
Yeah.
With primitive tools.
Pickaxes, sweat, and blood. And its only function is to catch runoff rainwater during the brief wet season, hoping it holds enough to keep you alive during the brutal dry season.
So the water in a cistern is entirely dependent on human engineering.
Entirely. It is stagnant. It gets warm, it grows algae, insects breed in it, and dirt washes into it.
Ugh, that sounds awful. But the text adds a critical modifier, doesn't it? It says these are broken cisterns.
Yes, and that's the kicker. Limestone is porous, it shifts, it cracks.
Oh, man.
You can spend 6 months sweating and bleeding to carve out this massive tank, wait all winter for the rains to fill it, and a microscopic fissure in the rock will slowly, silently drain all that water away into the dirt.
The absolute futility of that image is just heartbreaking. You go to lower your bucket in the middle of the summer drought and you just hit hot mud.
Exactly, hot mud.
And yet, this is the perfect psychological blueprint for modern consumerism, the hedonic treadmill, and our obsession with status. It's the human condition.
We're dying of existential thirst.
Yes. There is a clear, flowing mountain spring of genuine connection, stillness, and spiritual grounding right next to us. But we completely ignore it.
Instead, we grab a pickaxe and we exhaust ourselves. We burn out, we ruin our health, we sacrifice our families digging a muddy hole in the desert of our careers or our social media profiles, desperately hoping it fills up with enough dopamine to keep us going.
So why are we wired to prefer the muddy hole?
It comes down to the illusion of control. A living spring is a gift which requires surrender and humility to receive. You don't control the spring. But a cistern represents human agency. We carved it, we measure it, we own it. We desperately want to be the architects of our own fulfillment.
We want to own the water supply.
Yes. We believe that if we just engineer the perfect career trajectory or accumulate the exact right amount of wealth or curate the flawless public image, we can permanently secure our own happiness.
But the philosophical argument of the text is that the human soul is designed with an infinite capacity, an infinite thirst.
Right. And when we attempt to satisfy an infinite thirst with finite manufactured things, money, power, prestige, those finite things literally crack under the existential pressure.
Wow. A career is a wonderful thing, but it is a broken cistern if you ask it to provide your ultimate spiritual validation.
It cannot hold that weight. It will leak.
Now, the text gets incredibly aggressive in how it describes our addiction to these broken cisterns.
It does. It uses imagery that is jarring to modern ears.
Very jarring. It compares the nation's frantic pursuit of foreign idols and political alliances to an adulterous wife chasing lovers.
Yeah, it describes them as a swift dromedary traversing her ways and a wild ass used to the wilderness that snuffeth up the wind at her pleasure.
We definitely need to pause here and apply some discernment, because the language is volatile.
Absolutely. The text heavily relies on the ancient patriarchal framing of its era, utilizing metaphors of female harlotry and animalistic sexual heat to depict the horror of idolatry.
And for a modern listener, this language can be deeply uncomfortable or alienating.
And rightfully so, if read without context. But if we analyze the mechanics of the metaphor, rather than getting stuck on the ancient cultural container, we uncover a profoundly vulnerable core.
Yeah, we have to look at the core emotional resonance. This isn't just a judge reading a list of legal infractions. This is the raw, agonizing grief of a betrayed partner.
Exactly. In chapter 2, the divine voice says, I remember thee, the kindness of thy youth, the love of thine espousals, when thou wentest after me in the wilderness.
It's recalling this beautiful, intimate honeymoon phase of total trust and devotion.
The tragedy isn't just that they broke a rule. The tragedy is that they abandoned a profound relationship to go frantically sniff the wind for anything else that might momentarily distract them.
It is the anatomy of betrayal and the desperation of addiction. They are wildly, indiscriminately chasing stimuli.
And this diagnosis of the human condition is not an isolated biblical concept. If we look at comparative insights across human history, every major wisdom tradition identifies this exact problem.
Oh, for sure. The Stoics warned extensively against tying your tranquility to external, uncontrollable variables.
Buddhist philosophy centers on the idea that attachment to transient, finite things is the root of all suffering.
Even modern neurobiology maps this out through the dopamine cycle, right?
Yes, how we build tolerance to external rewards and require more and more stimuli just to feel a baseline of, okay, constantly carving new cisterns that constantly leak.
The diagnosis is universal. So the practical exercise for the listener in this segment is an internal audit.
I love that.
I want you to audit your cisterns. Look at the landscape of your life right now. Where are you currently expending a massive, disproportionate amount of energy digging for satisfaction, only to find you are chronically left feeling empty?
Is it the pursuit of a specific net worth?
Is it seeking validation from a person who cannot give it? Is it the doom-scrolling mechanism on your phone, hoping the next video finally satisfies the anxiety?
You have to identify the broken cistern. You have to acknowledge the mud at the bottom.
And then you have to ask yourself the hardest question. What would it actually look like to put the pickaxe down, stop digging, and turn toward a source of quiet, unengineered stillness?
That is a highly disruptive audit to perform, largely because our culture actively incentivizes us to keep digging.
It really does. And worse, we build elaborate psychological defenses to convince ourselves that our cisterns are perfectly fine.
Which brings up a critical question.
Right. If Jeremiah's society is decaying and everyone is drinking from broken cisterns, why isn't the population in a state of panic?
Why don't they see the collapse coming?
Exactly. And the answer the text provides in chapters 4 and 7 is chilling. It's because they have insulated themselves with performative religion and ideological shields.
The historical context of chapter 7 is just a masterstroke of prophetic confrontation. Jeremiah is commanded to go stand directly at the gate of the Lord's house, the magnificent temple in Jerusalem, and deliver a blistering critique to the people precisely as they are walking through the doors to worship.
So he is literally standing at the church doors on a Sunday morning, telling everyone walking in that their attendance means nothing.
Exactly. And to understand why this was so deeply offensive, we have to revisit King Josiah's reforms.
Because the temple had been cleaned up and the proper rituals restored.
Right. And because of this architectural and liturgical revival, the population had developed a lethal sense of false security.
They believed that the physical presence of the temple in their city functioned as like a divine talisman.
Yes. They thought God lives in this building, so God will never allow this city to be conquered.
They were walking through the streets chanting a mantra. Right?
They were. The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these. It was an incantation to ward off the anxiety of the Babylonian threat.
It's the ultimate magical thinking. They believed their institutional affiliation granted them diplomatic immunity from the consequences of their actual behavior.
And Jeremiah shatters that illusion with a hammer. He intercepts them at the gate and tells them that their meticulous rituals and beautiful buildings are completely worthless if their societal ethics are corrupt.
He actually lays out the metrics of a healthy society, doesn't he?
He does. If you thoroughly amend your ways and your doings, if you thoroughly execute judgment between a man and his neighbor, if you oppress not the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, and shed not innocent blood in this place, then will I cause you to dwell in this place.
Wow. He's exposing the mechanics of cognitive dissonance. They're using performative piety as a smokescreen for systemic cruelty.
They sing the right songs at the temple, and then they go exploit the marginalized in the marketplace.
It's wild.
Yeah.
And to explain how a human heart gets to this point of profound hypocrisy, he uses a brilliant agricultural metaphor in chapter 4.
Ah, yes, the fallow ground. God tells the people, break up your fallow ground and sow not among thorns.
Okay, so what are the actual mechanics of fallow ground?
Well, fallow ground is not a barren desert. It is land that possesses the intrinsic potential for incredible fruitfulness.
But it's been neglected.
Right. Over time, through sheer neglect and being constantly trampled upon, the topsoil becomes severely compacted. It turns hard as concrete.
And then weeds take over.
Exactly. It gets overgrown with deep-rooted weeds and thorns. If a farmer simply walks out and scatters high-quality, expensive seed over the top of fallow ground, nothing will happen.
Because the seed cannot penetrate the hard dirt.
The birds will eat it, or the existing thorns will immediately choke out any shallow roots.
So to get fruit, you have to do the violent, exhausting work of driving an iron plow deep into that compacted dirt and ripping it wide open.
You have to expose the dark soil underneath to the sun and pull the thorns out by the roots.
It is a perfect metaphor for neuroplasticity and the calcification of human habits. We form pathways in our brains based on repeated behaviors.
Over time, our prejudices, our selfish reactions, and our comfortable hypocrisies become hardwired. They become our fallow ground.
And Jeremiah adds an even more intimate, provocative metaphor, telling them to circumcise yourselves to the Lord and take away the foreskins of your heart.
In their ancient context, physical circumcision was the ultimate unquestionable marker of identity. It meant you were in the club.
But the text argues that external identity markers are utterly useless if the internal core of the heart remains calloused, covered, and unresponsive to empathy and justice.
And here is where we hit a massive, towering obstacle to growth for the modern listener.
Right, because we read about these ancient people chanting the temple of the Lord, and we roll our eyes at their naivety.
But the psychological mechanism hasn't changed. We've just updated the vocabulary.
Oh, 100%. We absolutely use ideological labels as shields to protect us from doing the painful work of plowing our own fallow ground.
How so? Like, what are the modern equivalents?
Well, we chant things like, I have the correct political views, or I listen to the right news programs, or I eat organic and follow the best wellness gurus, or I am an ally.
We curate these incredibly sophisticated, aesthetically pleasing moral identities online and in our social circles.
Exactly. And we subconsciously believe that because we hold all the right opinions, we are automatically good people. We use our ideological alignment to deflect genuine self-reflection.
It allows us to ignore the fact that we might be deeply uncharitable to our spouses, incredibly selfish with our resources, or deeply cynical in our daily interactions.
We scatter the good seed of our progressive or conservative ideals right on top of a heart that is hard, judgmental, and overgrown with the thorns of our own ego.
It is the danger of confusing affiliation with transformation. An opinion is not a virtue until it is incarnated into action. An incarnating virtue requires the painful plowing of our internal landscape.
That hits hard. So the question for you, the listener, to sit with today is this. What is your fallow ground?
What are the hardened, compacted habits of thought, the unexamined prejudices, or the comfortable, cynical routines that you have allowed to solidify over the years?
What specific label are you using to make yourself feel morally secure while avoiding the hard work of actual behavioral change? If you want a different harvest in your life, you cannot just scatter new intentions over old habits. You have to take the plow to the dirt.
And that requires a level of brutal self-honesty that is exceptionally difficult to sustain. Because, as the text explores next, the human mind is actively working against us in this process.
The text gets incredibly granular about this in chapters 17, 18, and 19. If we're going to break up our fallow ground, we have to first understand the profound unreliability of our own internal compass.
Chapter 17 delivers what is arguably the most devastating and perhaps the most famous psychological assessment in the entire book.
What does it say?
Verse 9 states, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it?"
That is strong language.
Very. And the term translated as desperately wicked is the Hebrew word anash, which is often translated elsewhere as mortally sick, incurable, or frail.
The heart is deceitful above all things. Let's just pause and recognize what a massive head-on collision that is with modern Western culture.
Oh, completely.
I mean, our entire cultural narrative is built on this sort of Disney-fied mantra of just follow your heart.
Yeah.
We treat our internal emotional state as if it is this pure, uncorrupted, infallible oracle of objective truth. If I feel it, it must be right.
But the biblical text fundamentally rejects that premise. In biblical anthropology, the heart isn't just the seat of romantic emotion. It represents the total center of human intellect, will, and emotional processing.
And the text argues that this processing center, when left to its own devices, is a master of rationalization.
It is deeply compromised. Earlier in that same chapter, it says that the sin of Judah is written with a pen of iron and with the point of a diamond engraved on the tablets of their heart.
So the corruption is not a surface-level stain that can be easily washed off.
No, it is deeply structurally etched into their core operating system.
And the fascinating thing is that modern cognitive psychology completely and totally validates this ancient premise.
It does. How so?
Our brains are absolute factories for cognitive biases. The idea that our minds objectively seek truth is a biological fiction.
Right.
We suffer from confirmation bias, where we aggressively filter out any information that contradicts our pre-existing beliefs while clinging to anything that supports them.
And the fundamental attribution error.
Exactly. Where we judge other people by their actions, usually assuming the worst about their character, but we judge ourselves by our unseen, noble intentions.
We have the Dunning-Kruger effect, moral licensing, motivated reasoning.
The human brain is essentially an algorithm designed by evolution to protect our ego, justify our desires, and ensure our social survival, not to seek objective moral truth.
The heart is quite literally a deceitful mechanism. And that is why the text presents a stark binary contrast immediately before that famous verse.
Okay, what's the contrast?
It contrasts two fundamentally different ways of anchoring your life. The person who trusts in man and makes flesh his arm, meaning the person who relies entirely on human power, and the corrupted algorithm of their own deceitful heart, is described as a destitute shrub or a heath in the desert.
So they inhabit the parched, salty, uninhabitable places.
They are fragile and entirely dependent on the chaotic weather of their circumstances.
But the alternative?
The alternative is the person who trusts in the Lord, who anchors their reality in an objective, eternal truth outside of their own ego and shifting emotions.
And how are they described?
This person is described as a tree planted by the waters. It sends its roots deep into the riverbank, and the crucial detail is that this tree doesn't even notice when the heat comes.
The drought still happens, the external circumstances are still brutal.
But because its roots are tapping into an external, reliable source, its leaf is always green, and it never stops yielding fruit.
It is the profound difference between trying to draw your identity from the broken cistern of your own ego versus being planted next to the infinite spring.
Exactly.
But this raises a massive philosophical problem.
Which is?
Well, if our hearts are mortally sick, if the bad code is engraved with an iron pen, how do we ever change? If I am a deceitful algorithm, am I just doomed? Is my future predetermined by my flaws?
That is the essential tension of human existence, and it is answered by one of the most beautiful, complex, and debated metaphors in the entire book, the visit to the potter's house in chapter 18.
Okay, tell us about the potter's house.
God commands Jeremiah to go down to the local potter's house and simply observe the artisan at work. Jeremiah watches the potter spinning the stone wheels with his feet, working a lump of wet clay with his hands.
Pretty standard ancient craftsmanship.
Right. But as Jeremiah watches, the vessel that the potter is forming gets marred in the hand of the potter. There's a flaw in the clay, a hard pebble, or it simply collapses under the centrifugal force and loses its shape.
Now let's focus on the potter's reaction, because the instinct of a frustrated artist would be to scrape the ruined clay off the wheel and throw it in the trash.
But he doesn't. The text says the potter simply crushes the marred clay back into a lump right there on the spinning wheel, and he makes it again into another vessel, as seemed good to the potter to make it.
Wow.
And then the divine voice speaks to Jeremiah. O house of Israel, cannot I do with you as this potter? Behold, as the clay is in the potter's hand, so are you in mine hand.
Now, I have to push back here because this text is often weaponized.
How so?
On the surface, this sounds like absolute cold determinism. It sounds like God is saying, you are just helpless, dumb blobs of dirt. I'm going to mold you into whatever shape I want, and you have zero agency, zero free will, and no say in the matter. It completely removes all human responsibility.
It can certainly be read that way, and entire theological frameworks have actually been built on that deterministic reading.
Right.
However, we must apply careful wisdom and read the very next verses because they completely subvert the deterministic assumption.
Oh, they do?
Yes. The text immediately reveals a shockingly responsive, interactive deity. It is not a static, fatalistic script. God explains the metaphor by saying, "At what instant I shall speak concerning a nation, to pluck up and to pull down and to destroy it. If that nation turn from their evil, I will repent of the evil that I thought to do unto them."
Wait, I will repent of the evil.
Yes. And conversely, if he promises to build a nation up and they choose to do evil, he says, I will repent of the good.
That is a massive theological statement. It implies that the future is not chiseled in granite. It is spinning on a wheel.
It implies a deeply dynamic, real-time relationship between human agency and divine sovereignty.
The shape of the vessel is heavily dependent on how the clay responds to the pressure of the potter's hands.
Precisely. If the clay stubbornly resists, it becomes marred. The beauty of the metaphor is the resilience of grace.
When the clay is marred, when a human life makes a catastrophic error, or society collapses into corruption, the potter's first instinct is not disposal.
No, it is recreation. He works the flaw into a new design. He takes the ruined experience and shapes it into a different, perhaps more humble, but equally necessary vessel.
As long as the clay remains soft and stays on the wheel, the flaw does not have to be fatal.
But there is a terrifying flip side to the physics of clay. it doesn't stay soft and pliable forever.
No, it dries out.
It does.
Oh.
And that leads directly to chapter 19, which serves as the severe, terrifying counterpoint to the grace of the potter's wheel.
What happens in chapter 19?
God commands Jeremiah to go back to the potter, but this time he is told to buy a finished, fired, hardened earthen flask.
So it's already been through the kiln.
Yes. He is then told to gather the senior leaders and priests and lead them out of the city into the valley of Hinnom, also known as Tophet.
We need to explain Tophet, because it is not just a random piece of real estate.
Not at all. It is the darkest, most traumatic location in Judah's geography. Tophet was a deep ravine outside Jerusalem where, during their worst periods of idolatry, the Israelites had actively practiced child sacrifice to foreign gods like Moloch. Oh my God.
It was a place of literal ashes, bones, and unspeakable horror. It is the geographic location that later Jewish and Christian thought would use to conceptualize Gehenna, or hell. It is the ultimate symbol of human depravity.
So Jeremiah takes the leaders of the nation, the people responsible for the moral decay, and he stands them in the middle of this graveyard of their own making.
And while standing in the ashes of Tophet, Jeremiah takes this beautifully finished, hardened clay flask, and he violently smashes it to pieces against the rocks in front of them.
The psychological violence of that prophetic act is staggering.
And he delivers the decree. Even so will I break this people in this city, as one breaketh a potter's vessel that cannot be made whole again.
It is the end of the line.
It highlights a severe reality that modern audiences deeply resist. We love the narrative of endless second chances. We love the image of the soft clay on the wheel constantly being remade.
But the text insists that there is a definitive point of no return. Yes. Chronic, sustained stubbornness, continually resisting the shaping hands of reality, continually justifying the deceitful algorithm of our own hearts, eventually calcifies us.
The clay dries out.
And once character is fired in the kiln of our own obstinance, it can no longer be gently reshaped. If it is fundamentally flawed after it is hardened, the only structural option left is for it to be shattered.
I think we all know people who have reached that stage. If you spend 40 years practicing deep selfishness, building a monument to your own ego, you do not magically wake up at age 60 and decide to be pliable and generous.
Your neural pathways have hardened like fired clay.
You become a brittle, fragile person who eventually shatters when life hits you with something you can't control. So the practical application here is urgent.
What is it?
The practice is stay on the wheel. When life or your own massive failures or the consequences of your deceitful heart mar your current shape, do not let your ego dry out and harden in bitterness.
You mean pliable.
Yes, accept the agonizing pressure of the potter's hands. Allow yourself to be crushed down and remolded, rather than aggressively defending your flawed position and risking being shattered beyond repair.
Remaining soft clay requires a daily, sometimes excruciating exercise of humility.
And delivering that message standing in Tophet and smashing that flask requires an unimaginable psychological toll on the messenger, which forces us to look at the human cost of this entire endeavor.
It really does.
We've spent an hour talking about the heavy prophetic diagnoses Jeremiah is delivering: the broken cisterns, the fallow ground, the deceitful heart. But what are the mechanics of what this is actually doing to Jeremiah's psyche?
It is dismantling him piece by piece. The book of Jeremiah is incredibly unique among ancient prophetic literature because of its intense autobiographical vulnerability.
Most ancient texts focus entirely on the theology and the message, right?
Right. But Jeremiah pulls the curtain back and shows us the visceral, agonizing psychological toll on the messenger. Chapters 15, 16, and 20 provide a shockingly raw portrait of isolation, depression, and what we would clinically call total burnout.
The historical context of his daily life in chapter 16 is brutal. God places severe draconian restrictions on how he is allowed to live.
He is structurally isolated from all human comfort. The divine command is explicit. Thou shalt not take thee a wife, neither shalt thou have sons or daughters in this place.
And in an ancient Near Eastern culture where your entire identity, your economic survival, and your legacy were tied to your family and your children, being forbidden to marry was a social death sentence.
Furthermore, he is forbidden to enter a house of mourning to lament with his neighbors, and he is forbidden to enter a house of feasting to celebrate weddings or festivals.
Let's analyze the sociology of that. He is completely cut off from the fundamental stabilizing rhythms of human community.
He has no spouse to process his day with. He has no children to give him hope for the future. He can't share in collective grief, and he can't participate in collective joy. He is an island of impending doom.
And this isolation is not merely passive. It quickly turns into active, violent hostility.
Why is that?
Because he is standing in the temple gates and the city squares, constantly telling the political and religious elites that their institutions are corrupt, their foreign policies are suicidal, and that the Babylonians are going to destroy them.
So he is branded a traitor.
Yes. The people of his own hometown, Anathoth, plot to assassinate him. Pashur, the chief governor of the temple, has him publicly beaten and locked in the wooden stocks overnight, exposed to the elements and the mockery of the city.
He is the ultimate, universally despised whistleblower in a society that is desperately colluding to maintain its illusions.
And eventually, that constant friction breaks him. In chapter 20, we witness Jeremiah hit absolute rock bottom. He unleashes what has to be the most honest, painful, and boundary-pushing prayer recorded in the text.
The language he uses borders on outright blasphemy, doesn't it?
It does. He cries out, "O Lord, thou hast deceived me, and I was deceived. Thou art stronger than I, and hast prevailed. I am in derision daily. Everyone mocketh me."
Thou hast deceived me.
The Hebrew word translated as deceive is patha, which can carry the intense connotation of being seduced, persuaded, or physically overpowered.
He is accusing the divine of entrapment.
He is essentially screaming, "You tricked me into this. You overpowered my will. You handed me this impossible calling, and now my life is a living, breathing hell of mockery and violence."
I just want to sit with the sheer shock value of that for a second. This is canonical scripture. This is a recognized major prophet openly accusing God of deception and abuse of power.
The rawness of that lament is breathtaking.
And he doesn't stop there. By the end of chapter 20, he is cursing the very biology of his existence.
He says, "Cursed be the day wherein I was born. Cursed be the man who brought tidings to my father, saying, A man-child is born unto thee."
He explicitly wishes he had been killed in the womb, so his mother could have served as his grave.
It is the absolute definition of the dark night of the soul. It is clinical depression. It is the total collapse of his emotional resilience.
But the genius of the text is what happens right in the middle of this despair. Jeremiah makes a rational decision to save himself.
He says, "Then I said, I will not make mention of him, nor speak any more in his name." He decides to quit.
He hands in his resignation. He resolves to just go home, be quiet, and live a normal life.
The ultimate attempt at self-preservation. But he can't do it, can he?
No. The very next sentence captures the inescapable nature of his calling. He says, "But his word was in mine heart, as a burning fire shut up in my bones. And I was weary with forbearing, and I could not stay."
A fire shut up in my bones. The mechanics of that are fascinating.
He's in absolute agony when he speaks the truth, because speaking the truth brings physical violence, isolation, and public hatred.
But he discovers that he is in even greater consuming agony when he attempts to swallow the truth and live a lie, because the truth is quite literally burning him from the inside out.
He is compelled by the sheer gravity of reality.
This provides a profound, desperately needed translation for modern life, particularly regarding how we view success and purpose.
We are suffocated by a culture and often a religious or self-help subculture that curates a very specific aesthetic of success.
We are sold the narrative that if you are pursuing your true purpose, if you are doing the right thing, the universe will reward you. You will feel deeply fulfilled, you will achieve work-life balance, and you will be #blessed.
The perfectly filtered, always smiling success story. If you are stressed, you must be out of alignment.
Exactly. But Jeremiah completely validates the agonizing, often destructive burden of the truth teller.
If you are a whistleblower calling out systemic racism in your department, if you are the one sibling in your family refusing to play along with the generational cycle of abuse, or if you are an artist trying to inject genuine meaning into a fiercely superficial culture,
pursuing that heavy, meaningful purpose will very likely cost you your comfort.
it will invite misunderstanding. It might isolate you from the people you love. It might break your heart.
It proves that experiencing deep despair, going through clinical burnout, or enduring a dark night of the soul is not a symptom of failure.
It is not a sign that your calling is wrong or that you are fundamentally broken. It might just be the natural, unavoidable tax you pay for engaging intimately with reality while everyone else around you is comfortably hiding behind their broken cisterns and fallow ground.
It is so deeply refreshing to read something this violently honest. It gives us permission to be human.
It dismantles the toxic expectation of perpetual happiness. So here's the reflection for you. It is okay to be brutally honest about your despair.
When you are carrying the weight of a heavy, meaningful commitment, you do not have to put on a brave face.
You do not have to pretend it isn't destroying you a little bit. Where in your life right now do you need to give yourself explicit permission to grieve the cost of your purpose?
Where do you need to acknowledge the fire in your bones, but also give yourself the grace to admit that the fire is causing third-degree burns?
That level of raw honesty is the only psychological mechanism that allows you to survive the fire. Because if you deny the pain, if you try to paste a smile over the burn, you become incredibly vulnerable to the people offering an easy, painless way out.
And oh man, were there people offering an easy way out in Jeremiah's day?
This brings us perfectly to our final major thematic exploration. Toxic positivity versus the refining crucible of adversity. We are looking at chapters 23, 24, and 25.
While Jeremiah is out in the streets agonizing over the truth, ruining his reputation and his mental health to deliver these desperate warnings, there is an entire highly lucrative cottage industry of religious professionals making a killing by selling the populace pleasant, comfortable lies.
We see the mechanics of this exposed in chapter 23. The divine voice delivers a scathing, systemic denunciation of the institutional false prophets.
The text says, "They speak a vision of their own heart, and not out of the mouth of the Lord. They say, still unto them that despise me, the Lord hath said, you shall have peace. And they say unto every one that walketh after the imagination of his own heart, no evil shall come upon you."
It is the 7th century BCE equivalent of toxic positivity. Good vibes only. Everything happens for a reason. Just manifest your reality.
Try to conceptualize the profound sociological damage of this. These prophets are looking at a society that is fundamentally corrupt, a society that is exploiting the poor, shedding innocent blood, and ignoring the massive Babylonian army marching toward their borders.
And they are standing on the street corners saying, don't worry, God loves us. The economy is strong. Peace is coming. Your personal truth is valid. And absolutely nothing bad is going to happen.
Why do societies consistently fund and elevate people who lie to them?
Because human beings possess a nearly infinite capacity to seek out placebos.
The false prophets are supplying a market demand for comfort. They are using the recognizable vocabulary of faith, they say, the Lord hath said, but they systematically strip the message of any demand for ethical repentance, justice, or accountability.
They offer the psychological comfort of religion without the behavioral cost of transformation.
And God dramatically contrasts their soothing placebo with the violent reality of his own word, asking, "Is not my word like as a fire, saith the Lord, and like a hammer that breaketh the rock in pieces?"
I love that analogy. It's like a patient who comes into a hospital with a leg that was shattered in a car wreck and healed completely crooked.
The false prophet is the quack doctor who comes in, looks at the deformed leg and says, just think positive thoughts, rub some lavender essential oil on it, and try to walk it off.
It sounds lovely. It is exactly what the terrified patient wants to hear.
Yeah.
But it is a lie that is going to leave them permanently crippled.
Jeremiah is the trauma surgeon who walks into the room, looks at the x-ray and says, look, this bone healed wrong. The only way you are ever going to walk properly again is if we take a hammer, break this bone a second time, and reset it, and it is going to be agonizing.
The hammer breaking the rock. It is a painful, violent intervention, but is the only mechanism that leads to actual structural healing.
And this deep conflict between the appeal of a pleasant illusion and the necessity of painful reality comes to a head in a brilliant, highly counterintuitive metaphor in chapter 24.
The vision of the 2 baskets of figs.
Yes. To understand the profound shock of this metaphor, we have to establish a brief timeline of the Babylonian invasion. The destruction of Jerusalem did not happen in one single weekend.
That happened in waves, didn't it?
It did. In 597 BCE, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon attacked the city and initiated the first major wave of deportation. He captured the young Judean king, the royal family, the skilled artisans, the wealthy elites, and the military leaders, and he dragged them hundreds of miles away into exile in Babylon.
A massive brain drain and decapitation of the society.
Exactly. But Nebuchadnezzar didn't destroy the city yet. He left a puppet king named Zedekiah in charge, along with the poorer, less influential citizens who remained in Jerusalem.
So imagine the psychology of the people who were left behind in Jerusalem. They look around, they see that the elites have been dragged off to a pagan empire, but they are still sleeping in their own beds. They are still near the temple.
Human nature dictates exactly how they interpreted this. They thought, wow, we are the righteous ones. We are the lucky ones. God protected us because we're faithful. Those people who got dragged off in chains must have been the really bad sinners.
It is the deeply ingrained human assumption that comfort equates to divine blessing and trauma equates to a curse.
But God gives Jeremiah a vision of 2 baskets of figs sitting in front of the temple. One basket is filled with exceptionally good figs, like the first ripe figs of the harvest.
And the other?
The other basket is filled with figs that are so incredibly rotten they cannot even be eaten.
And the interpretation of the vision completely violently flips the script on their theology.
It does. God points to the good figs and says, "Like these good figs, so will I acknowledge them that are carried away captive of Judah, whom I have sent out of this place into the land of the Chaldeans for their good. For I will set mine eyes upon them for good, and I will give them a heart to know me."
The text explicitly declares that the exiles, the people who suffered the immense, horrifying trauma of a siege, being ripped from their ancestral lands and marched across a desert to live as subjugated refugees in a pagan empire, they are the good figs.
Which means the bad figs are.
The bad figs are the people who stayed behind in the comfort of Jerusalem, arrogantly thinking they had avoided the disaster.
God says he will deliver those remaining in the city to be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth for their hurt, to be a reproach and a proverb, eventually facing total destruction.
Okay, I have to push back hard on the mechanics of this. Because to a modern ear, this sounds dangerously close to romanticizing trauma.
I can see why you'd say that.
We hear this today, the idea that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, or that God gives his toughest battles to his strongest soldiers. But we know from modern psychology that trauma often just breaks people. It causes PTSD, it ruins nervous systems, it passes down generational damage.
That is a very valid point.
How do we separate the idea of meaningful, refining adversity from just senseless, destructive tragedy? Is the text just trying to put a positive spin on a horrific war crime?
That is a vital distinction to make. The text is absolutely not saying that the violence of the Babylonians is inherently good, or that trauma itself is a positive thing to be sought out.
Okay.
What the text is arguing is a reality about the environment required for deep character transformation. The people in Jerusalem were stuck in an environment of total illusion. As long as they had the physical temple, as long as they had their familiar political structures, they were never, ever going to plow their fallow ground.
We're going to keep rotting in their complacency.
Their comfort was the incubator for their decay. The exile to Babylon was a brutal severing of every single broken cistern they relied upon. It stripped away the temple, the monarchy, and their national identity.
It forced them into the absolute bedrock of reality.
And the promise is that within that crucible of reality, stripped of all their ideological shields, they would finally develop the internal architecture, a circumcised heart necessary to actually know God.
Babylon is the hammer breaking the rock so it can be reset. Jerusalem is the rotting leg infected with gangrene because it refused the surgery.
Growth can only happen in the environment of reality, even if that reality is excruciating. And in chapter 25, this unavoidable collision with reality is summarized in the terrifying image of the cup of the wine of wrath.
God commands Jeremiah to take this metaphorical cup of judgment and force all the surrounding nations to drink it.
The imagery implies that there is a cumulative consequence to human history, an unavoidable pain of reality that must be processed. You have to drink it.
Listening to the false prophets who whisper, "You can bypass the pain, you won't have to drink the cup," only ensures that when the reality finally hits, you will be utterly destroyed by it.
You cannot hack your way around the consequences of a deceitful heart or a corrupt society. The adversity is the kiln that fires the clay.
So here's your final deeply practical question for this deep dive. I want you to look at the landscape of your own life, specifically the areas of exile or the profound hardships you are enduring.
Is it possible that the situation you currently view as an absolute unmitigated disaster, the devastating job loss, the public failure, the deeply painful transition, the thing you have labeled the bad figs?
Is it possible that it's actually the exact, highly specific environment needed to forge your character? Is it possible that the hardship is actually the good figs that will ultimately save you from the slow, silent rot of comfortable complacency?
It requires a monumental shift in perspective. It demands that we stop asking the universe, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking the much more difficult, much more generative question, "What is this environment currently forging within me?"
We have covered an immense, staggering amount of psychological and historical ground today.
We really have. We started in the small town of Anathoth, watching a terrified young man step into an impossible, daunting calling, learning to rely on his intrinsic design rather than his resume.
We dissected the exhausting tragedy of carving out broken cisterns, exposing our endless human attempt to find infinite meaning in finite manufactured things.
We challenged ourselves to do the violent work of breaking up our fallow ground and to stop hiding behind performative ideological labels that mask our lack of genuine transformation.
We stared into the uncomfortable reality of our own deceitful, biased hearts. And we recognized the absolute necessity of remaining soft and pliable in the potter's wheel, accepting the painful pressure of reality to avoid becoming irreparably hardened.
We fully validated the dark night of the soul, recognizing the agonizing, isolating toll that truth-telling takes, and how the fire in your bones can burn you even as it drives you forward.
There, finally, we rejected the toxic, soothing placebos of the false prophets, embracing the profound, counterintuitive truth that the terrifying adversity of exile might be the very crucible that brings about our ultimate character and salvation.
It is a breathtaking journey through these first 25 chapters.
It is. And as we close, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to carry with you. Think about the life of Jeremiah. By every single metric of his own culture and by almost every metric of ours, this man's life was an abject, miserable failure.
He was forbidden to have a family, he was publicly mocked, beaten, locked in the stocks, branded a political traitor, and he suffered such profound depression that he cursed the biology of his own conception.
He watched his city burn, just as he predicted.
He was a man acquainted with relentless grief.
But look at the reality from our vantage point, over 2.5 millennia later. The mighty empire of Babylon. It has been dust and sand for thousands of years. The arrogant kings who mocked him, the false prophets who sold the pleasant lies, the priests who locked him in the stocks.
They are completely forgotten, reduced to footnotes in a history book.
But Jeremiah, the isolated kid from Anathoth, his words survived the collapse of his nation. His words survived the Babylonian exile. His agonizing, fiery, brutally truthful words are still shaping human consciousness, ethics, and resilience today.
He truly was the iron pillar. The wind blew, the storm raged, but he did not snap.
What if the ultimate legacy of your life is not determined by your current comfort, your current popularity, or your current fleeting aesthetic of success? What if your true, enduring legacy is determined entirely by your willingness to hold on to the heavy, uncomfortable truth when everyone else around you is desperately, frantically grasping at illusions? What if the fire in your bones is the only light that will actually last? That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.